Asylum Inc. presents Phobic, an exploration of fear. The inverted gospel. The fluorescent bulbs hummed their sterile hymn above Ellis Monroe's head as he sat motionless in the consultation chair, his skeletal frame draped in clothes that hung like burial shrouds. His eyes, once perhaps green, now dulled to the color of stagnant pond water, tracked every minute movement in the room with the desperate precision of prey. Each breath he drew was measured, calculated, as though the very act of respiration might trigger some catastrophic rupture within his hollowed chest. Dr. Varnell had seen The Walking Dead before, patients so consumed by their terrors that life itself became a careful choreography of avoidance. But Monroe possessed something more unsettling, a terrible lucidity that made his emaciation seem not like madness, but like wisdom. When he spoke, his voice emerged as a whisper that seemed to crawl rather than flow, each word deliberate as a surgeon's incision. "You want to know about Vermont," he said, though she had not yet asked. "About the retreat, about why I cannot allow my body to evacuate what it contains." The woodland sanctuary had promised transcendence through deprivation, 5 days of silence, meditation, and ritual fasting in the shadow of ancient pines. Monroe had arrived seeking clarity, fleeing the suffocating grind of his advertising career, the endless cycle of consumption and regurgitation that defined his metropolitan existence. The irony was not lost on him now, as he sat before Dr. Varnell, his stomach a cavernous void that he dared not fill. The other retreatants had been typical seekers, urban professionals drunk on the mythology of spiritual awakening, their designer meditation cushions and organic hemp clothing betraying the very materialism they claimed to transcend. Monroe had felt superior to their pretensions, maintaining his contemptuous silence as they gathered in the communal hall for their sparse, ritualistic meals. The mushrooms had been foraged locally, prepared by Brother Augustine, the retreat's skeletal leader, whose eyes held the fevered gleam of the truly converted. They were served on the third morning, pale, flaccid things that resembled infants' fingers, floating in a thin broth that tasted of earth and decay. Monroe had consumed them without complaint, his body already 3 days hollow, his mind beginning to fray at the edges where hunger met enlightenment. The first convulsion had begun in Lydia Marsh, a yoga instructor from Hartford whose perfectly sculpted facade cracked like painted porcelain as her body folded inward. The sound that emerged from her throat was not quite human, a wet, choking gurgle that seemed to carry words, though in no language Monroe recognized. Her vomit, when it came, was black as tar and moved with purpose, pooling on the floor in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Then Marcus Tremaine doubled over, his lawyer's composure shattering as something that was not quite bile erupted from his mouth. But within the retching, Monroe heard it. A voice, thin and sibilant, speaking backward syllables that nevertheless conveyed meaning directly to his brain. The expelled matter writhed, forming shapes that resembled cuneiform script before dissolving into mere biological waste. One by one, they fell. Margaret Chen, the psychiatrist who had sat beside him, clawed at her own throat as she purged something that looked like liquid shadow. Her eyes rolled back, showing only bloodshot whites as she whispered between heaves. "It made us say it backwards. The words we were never meant to speak." But Monroe remained untouched. His stomach cramped, his vision swam, but no nausea came. He watched in horrified fascination as his fellow seekers expelled not just their morning meal, but something else. Something that had been waiting inside them, dormant, until the mushrooms awakened it. The retreat hall became a charnel house of revelation, bodies contorting as they birthed obscenities through their throats. Brother Augustine stood at the center of the chaos, his arms raised in ecstasy, his mouth moving in silent prayer as the vomit around him began to coalesce, forming a writhing mass that pulsed with malevolent intelligence. Monroe understood then that this was no accidental poisoning. This was communion, a feeding of something vast and hungry that dwelt in the spaces between thoughts. The official investigation found only contaminated mushrooms, ergot poisoning, mass hysteria. The survivors spoke of hallucinations, shared delusions brought on by fasting and toxic alkaloids. But Monroe knew better. He had been chosen to witness, not participate. He alone had been deemed unworthy of the gift that writhed in his companion's expelled essence. Now, in the sterile safety of Dr. Varnell's office, Monroe felt the weight of that terrible privilege. His body had become a temple of restraint, every meal a battle against the possibility that he might finally be found worthy. The thing that lived in reverse speech, in backward prayers, in the expelled truths of the poisoned, it was still out there, waiting. And somewhere deep in his hollow belly, Monroe feared it might already be waiting inside him too. He could not vomit, would not, because to purge was to speak, and to speak backwards was to open doors that had been locked since before language began. His starvation was not madness. It was the only sane response to a world where emptiness was the only salvation, where the void in his stomach was all that stood between reality and the howling chaos that dwelt in the spaces between thoughts. Dr. Varnell watched as Monroe's lips moved soundlessly, forming words that seemed to flow in reverse, and for just a moment, she could swear she heard something answering from the depths of her own churning stomach. Attending notes, Dr. Sylvie Varnell. Patient continues to exhibit severe somatic avoidance behaviors centered around emetic episodes. Cognitive function remains remarkably intact, despite prolonged malnutrition. Of particular note, during our third session, I experienced acute nausea that subsided only when Monroe ceased his backward counting exercise. Recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation and possible transfer to secure wing. I find myself increasingly reluctant to eat before our sessions, though I cannot articulate why. The Vermont incident requires further investigation. Too many inconsistencies in the official reports. Something feels deliberately obscured. Have ordered toxicology screens for all staff members who have had prolonged contact with Monroe. The feeling of something waiting in my throat grows stronger each day. If you found yourself stirred, unsettled, or just a bit more wary of shadows, consider offering a like to feed the entity that powers these tales. And should you subscribe, you may yet survive to hear the next whisper from the void.